Hello, everyone. This is What Your Pastor Didn't Tell You. Today, I am on with Dr. Ingrid Faro. We're going to be talking about Judah and Tamar. We're also going to be talking about some of the Exodus narrative and Rahab. These are some really, really interesting passages where there's a lot of things going on that, I'll just be honest, we're not going to understand from our 21st century context about levirate marriage and why is Tamar looking like a prostitute? Isn't that bad? What's going on there? And all this other stuff, things that you're just not going to miss unless you understand how they were living back then. And so I'm really excited for this interview. There's a lot of interesting stuff going on here. How are you doing today, Dr. Farrow?
I'm doing great. Thanks. Appreciate
Awesome.
it.
Yeah. So you have a book coming out very shortly here, sometime in the next month. Is that right?
Yep, in about 3 weeks.
3 weeks. There you go. Yeah. And it's talking about women in the Old Testament. You talk about Eve, and you talk about these texts that we're going to talk about today. You have some other passages that you talk about, but we're going to specifically talk about those. But could you just give us a summary of what your book's about?
Sure. Well, I'd been teaching a class on women in the Old Testament for a couple of years. And as I was going for a 12-hour drive, a friend of mine prayed for me that I would get some fresh insight. So I was thinking, I just started praying and thinking about my class. And even though I'd been doing so much work on teaching Hebrew for, biblical Hebrew and exegesis for 11 years at that point, and teaching the Old Testament and teaching this class, I had never seen the connections, and all the connections between women in the Old Testament began to come together from Genesis 1, 2, 3, 4, and then on and on. And I saw that there was strategic placement of women in Scripture to initiate or advance key movements in redemption history. And that was just eye-opening for me, having studied it. So it was, by the time I finished my trip, it's like, I've got to write about this. So that's what got me going. And then I had to test every one, dig into the Hebrew, dig into the material culture, dig into the archaeological evidence, the other ancient Near Eastern understandings, the scholarship and everything. And so it became really a really encouraging and inspiring project. And really glad that I embarked on it.
That's awesome. That's really, really cool stuff. And what would you say is the main, like you said, there's like a message or like kind of thing that ties up like the different topics that you mentioned. Just
Yes.
specifically, could you say like, so you talked about Eve and like what made you choose those specific women? Were you just choosing women in the Old Testament?
Well, I did start out my proposal with 30 chapters, and they said too long. So there are more, and there's over 100 women in the Old Testament, named and
Wow.
unnamed. So it was a little hard to pare it down, but the women that I chose are at really critical junctures. So we've got the creation story, Genesis 2, 3, 4, and significant things happening right there that are frequently overlooked. And then, of course, Sarah, what's her role in there? And then we move to Tamar, who's, Judah, if the Messiah is going to come through the line of Judah, he starts out a real jerk. And so what happens to him? What is it that changes, what changes his whole way of thinking and acting and sends him back home? And then from there, you've got the Exodus, and the Exodus starts out with women. And then then you've got a lot of the law and itinerary tales and things like that. But then we make it then to beginning of Joshua, beginning of Judges, beginning of Samuel, beginning of Kings. Each have women that are initiating change. And because of the boldness, the courage of these women, history moves on and the line of the Messiah continues. And we have, and it then continues in a lot of smaller pericopes, smaller ways as well, all the way into the New Testament. And then it's picked up in the New Testament as well. So it's these threads, but I picked the women that were at these perhaps more prominent junctures in the biblical text where we can really go, oh, wow. I remember speaking to a good friend of mine who'd been teaching Old Testament Hebrew Bible for over 40 years. And first, when I told him about the concept of the book, he said, well, what about the Exodus? I mean, that's Moses. And then I told him about chapter 1 and 2 of Exodus. He went, oh, so he hadn't noticed it, and he's been immersed in it for 40 years.
Yeah.
So it's been really fun just recognizing, pulling out what is there
Mhm.
because, of course, so often women are overlooked. You almost never hear a sermon about women. Yeah, it's except in women's Bible studies or something. And so
Right.
it's overlooked. And so it's really bringing about what God says in Genesis, what scripture says in Genesis 1:26-28. In God's image, he created humanity, male and female, he created them. And then it just kind of picks up from there. Why is it important that there's
Mhm.
both male and female when the women are generally overlooked? So it's bringing out that element, which is important for the men to see too, because in scripture, it's when the men overlook the women that
Mhm.
things start to go downhill, or when they start to mistreat the women. Like Matthew Lynch has an article on male violence beginning in Genesis and so forth, and just pointing out that when the women are overlooked or mistreated, it means something is going to go wrong very quickly.
Interesting. That's
Yeah,
really fascinating.
yeah,
I'll have to check that out. I've had Dr. Lynch on here a couple times.
yeah.
So, yeah, I myself, I have not been hearing about these stories in women's Bible studies myself personally.
Yeah.
So I admit I missed a little bit out there. But maybe we can rein that back in here today. Um, so in your book, you talk about Joseph before you start talking about Tamar and Judah.
Mhm.
So, like in the passage, it starts. Is it 37 or is it 38? Yeah, 37 starts
Mhm.
talking about Joseph,
Yeah.
and Judah and Tamar don't even get mentioned. So, why is that important for the story?
Genesis 37, it starts the final major unit in the book of Genesis. So 37 all the way to the end, through the end of chapter 50, is
Hmm.
one big unit in
Hmm.
in the Hebrew text, and it's featuring Joseph, but it also does end up featuring Judah as well. But it starts out with Joseph, and Joseph is really the primary character in all of that.
Hmm.
And Joseph, we know, of course, he's the favorite son because he's the son of Rachel and so forth. And so there's some interesting things that happen in that text. But within 5 verses, there's 3 times that it says that the brothers, they hated Joseph, and then they hated him more. And after he tells his dreams, and they hated him still more. So it's really making the point they really hated Joseph.
Yeah.
And then the brothers are off taking care of the sheep in Shechem, which is where the whole scene with Dinah had taken place, and where these brothers had killed off all the men of that city. And so Jacob tells Joseph, go and check on your brothers in Shechem. So we got a little bit of historical things going on. He gets there, they're somewhere else. Brothers see Joseph coming, and they start plotting to
Hmm.
kill this dreamer. Let's kill this dreamer and his dreams. And so, great. You've got it there. Yep. And so again, as first Reuben is one who had really been on the outs with his dad for sleeping with his mother Leah's handmaid and so forth. So Reuben thinks this is his opportunity to get in good with his dad. So let's throw him in a cistern, and he had planned to rescue him and come back, the hero. But once he's in the cistern, now this is when Judah is introduced, and that's why 37 is important when we're going to look at what the life of Judah and Tamar and how it impacts them. So Judah then shows his leadership skills, and he said, why should we just kill him? Let's just sell him, because he sees these merchants coming along. And so he convinces the brothers to sell Joseph. They're assuming he's going to die in slavery, because we know that, because later on when they see him, before they realize it's him, they're talking about their brother who died. And so that was the assumption. Let's not get blood on our hands. Let's profit a little bit off of this. So they sell him and put, of course, the goat's blood on his special tunic that his father had given him. And then they bring this tunic. And since Judah had already shown himself the leader, there's a good chance Judah was the one coming forward with this tunic, and says these important words to Jacob. Do you recognize this? Or it could be translated, examine, please. And so then as soon as he brings forth that bloodied tunic and says, do you recognize this? Jacob just falls apart, and basically says, I'm going to go down to my grave in grief.
Okay.
And pretty much that ends that chapter. that pericope. And then it goes on. Then right from there, we have then chapter 38. And a lot of scholars used to say chapter 38 is just, kind of shoehorned in there. It doesn't fit, but it fits exactly, because we just had the scene where Judah shows what kind of a person he was, willing to sell his brother for profit in order so that he could get killed off. That's who Judah was. But then Judah sees his father's grief, and he leaves the family household, and he goes and he lives with the Canaanites. And in chapter 38, we can see he essentially becomes a Canaanite. And one of the ways we know, and I've got footnotes in the book, but the his staff, ring, and cord are all indications of a wealthy Canaanite. So someone who was prominent and prosperous. And so here Judah has left his family. He's living with the Canaanites, and for all practical purposes, he has become a Canaanite. He, quote, marries a woman, and the NIV begins it saying, and Judah married her, and they made love, and they had a son. But the Hebrew says, let's see what the version you have. Acquired a wife and slept with her. The Hebrew says he took her and came into her, and they had a son. She became pregnant, and she had a son. I mean, and even that take language, take and come in, even though she seems to technically be his wife, because again, it's not till after she dies that he's willing to take on a prostitute willingly. But nevertheless, the language is really coarse in the Hebrew, just really coarse language. So, and then of course, his first son, he finds him a Canaanite wife, and then he dies because he's evil. And then he does tell his second son, Onan, to go and do his obligation, provide a son. And that was just as the Israelites later would have the levirate marriage. Levirate marriage was something that was common throughout much of the Middle East, because there was no other security for women. So if a woman was a widow and she had no children, it was important to provide her with an heir and to continue the family line, to continue the name of the dead son. And so, but there were some differences in between what later became Israelite law and what archaeology has found was Canaanite law and some of the laws of the land. And so I've got the footnotes in the book as well, referring to the texts that talk about the laws of that land around that time. Levirate marriage, if a son died, his brother, the next in line, was the one who was to provide a son for the widow. You were to continue down the sons. But if there was no son, then the father-in-law would then be the next in line after the brothers. So that, of course, is very different from Israelite law. And yeah, we look at that, we go, ew. I mean, all of it is like, ew, but nevertheless, that was part of their culture. And just like we have certain laws and customs in our culture that other cultures will look at and go, ew, and will at later times as well. But we have to recognize what was acceptable and legal within their time. And so that also helps shift our understanding of the way we look at Tamar. First of all, the second son, from the Hebrew, you can see that we read that he went into her, and it says corrupted his seed, spilled the seed to make sure that he would not provide a son for her. And from the Hebrew, we can tell this was an ongoing practice. So he was sexually exploiting and abusing her with absolutely no intention of providing a son. He was simply basically raping her, but it doesn't use the language of rape, but it does say he was continually going into her and spilling his seed on the ground to make sure he did not impregnate her. So God took his life, and he died also. So then we just have the third son left. But then Tamar, once Judah's wife is deceased, she hears that he's going to be coming through the area. And it's interesting, she knows him well enough that if she dressed as a prostitute, she was certain that he would take her up on the offer. Sure, he'd offer to pay her, but nevertheless, she knew that about Judah also. So we're finding a little more about his character, both the way his sons turned out and the way he refused to take responsibility within the law for his own daughter-in-law. He just sent her home. And now when he finds out she's pregnant, his first response, once again, we're seeing what kind of character, burn her. that's it. Let's
Yeah.
let's just get rid of her once and for all. Finally, we can get rid of her. And that's when she comes forward with the ring, the cord, and the staff, and the words that he hadn't heard for perhaps 20 years. Do you recognize this? Do you recognize? Examine, please. And
Hmm.
and that it's her boldness, because she was still legally obligated to marry Shelah, his third son, but he had been withheld from her. So she had no options. She did not have the option to find another spouse, because technically she was still betrothed to his third son. So her only other option was her father-in-law, legally. So she was acting legally and forcing him to comply with the law, because she knew that he would not do it of his own volition. But she wanted to continue the family line and also seek justice. So she was simply seeking justice. But then when she comes forward, that is what then I could only express in my thinking God uses, or whatever it is that triggers Judah, because he would have, that those words had to have brought him back to the memory of his father and the reason that he left his father's family for the first time. And at that point, that's when he says, she is more righteous than I. And righteousness, sometimes we, Christian circles think of righteousness as doing what is right all the time. That's why we get up. Why is Lot called righteous? Why is Tamar called righteous? But in the especially in the Jewish literature, they talk about two kinds of justice and righteousness, where the word that we use generally for justice is retributive justice, getting what you deserve. But righteousness, they frequently call restorative justice, making things right. So that is an important form of righteousness. And Tamar is making things right. She is upholding the standard of the law. Judah recognizes it and takes responsibility for her. We're not told the narrative of how they got back to Jacob's family household, but we know that he returns to his household, because in the next scenes, he's with his brothers and his father again. And she is there. And Perez, of course, of the two twins, becomes in the line of the Messiah. And we see that genealogy. So she becomes incorporated into the household of Jacob. And we can see the transformation of Judah from that point. Not only do we know that he did return and integrate back into his own family, but in chapter 43, when they're starving from the famine, and they know in order to get grain again from Egypt, they have to bring Benjamin. And Jacob saying, no, he refuses to let go of Benjamin. And Reuben says, I'll give you my sons in exchange if he dies. And Jacob doesn't go along with that. Once again, Reuben kind of copping out. But then Judah says, I will give my life in exchange for Benjamin. So Judah, who was the one who had sold his Joseph into slavery, now becomes the one who says, I will now give my life for Benjamin. And then in chapter 45, when they're confronted by Joseph, not knowing it's Joseph, and Joseph is going to take Benjamin, and they think he's going to be taken into slavery. And once again, Judah steps forward with a long speech, says, I saw the grief of my father, and I promised my father I would give my life in exchange for my younger brother. So take me. And that is when Joseph falls apart and cries and tells who he is. So again, we see it was Tamar who was insisting on righteousness, and because she didn't give up, Judah had that opportunity to be transformed. And if that hadn't happened, who knows what would have happened to redemption history. So again, that becomes a really key turning point in redemption history. And again, it's a Canaanite woman who brings a man who had become a Canaanite back to his faith.
I really appreciate that summary, and talk about a redemption story, man.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I never would have even guessed that. So you have in the narrative of Genesis 37, you have Judah basically giving his brother away and saying like, hey, you know, here's the thing, and I'm lying to you, but here it is,
Yeah.
to his dad. And then he, acts pretty terribly. And there's a lot of reasons I think in this text, it basically frames Judah in a really bad way,
Mhm.
that I want to mention. And then you have the narrative with Tamar, and he does something also really, really bad. And then he's like, oh, shoot, I made a mistake.
Mhm.
I'm the one with this problem here. And then there's the redemption arc after that. That's really, really cool. I really appreciate you explaining that.
Yeah, thank you.
So there was a lot that you said there, that I wanted to talk about. So one, something that I noticed and what you brought out in your book is that it seems like, yeah, there, I guess the narrator is bringing out a bunch of negative things that it like almost make you want to say, hey, yeah, this Judah guy is really bad.
Mhm.
So for example, it mentions that he takes this Canaanite man, or Canaanite, the daughter of a Canaanite, Shua,
Mhm.
which maybe wouldn't sound that bad, except that in Genesis 24:3 and Genesis 28:1, it says that these Abraham and Isaac's descendants aren't supposed to be marrying Canaanites.
Mhm.
So it's like, oh, sure, you already made one mistake here.
Mhm.
And now there is the whole take language, and that's typically what's used of. Correct me if I'm wrong, but that's typically what's used of like this quote unquote married language is just laka, just to take, but it's kind of used idiomatically. Is that your understanding?
Well, actually, and in my chapter in Bathsheba, I go into a lot of detail on the Hebrew because there is
Okay.
no word for rape in Hebrew. And
Yeah.
so the word take is involved. But if it says take an eshet, and a woman or a wife, because eshet could be translated woman or wife, if it's take a woman or a wife, then that is marriage language. But if eshet is missing and it's just take and come into, then it means generally illicit sex. So it is
Hmm.
weird here that it doesn't specify that. And so, and then take also is uh, like in Genesis 3, the woman saw and she took. Genesis 6, the sons of God saw that the daughters of Adam were good and they took all of whom they wanted. And so take, and then in the story of Dinah and Shechem, he took her and came into her, and but there's some violence language that's used there. But again, that take language uh, can it's within a sexual relationship generally, like even with David and Bathsheba, the first time that he takes her is
Yeah.
just he took her. But then after they're married, then it says, then he took her, and includes Eshet as his wife. And
Hmm.
so, but it's not till after they're married that that language then is included. So we can see, so extensive studies on how do you tell if it's illicit sex or if it's husband and wife relationship. And it's that important word is the word wife there.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. So here's a fun question.
Mhm.
Um, I don't want to say the word because you two might, maybe you already said it, who knows? But they don't like the R word,
Oh, yeah,
the
sorry.
the grape word.
Yeah.
But is
Yeah.
there a reason for why there is not a word for grape in biblical Hebrew?
Um, there's not a reason. Yeah, it's just not there. It's just there's other language that they use in order to describe it.
Yeah. Yeah. I imagine some scholars might mention something along the lines of like they didn't see that moral aspect. I know some scholars have talked about how like they kind of saw women as property, so
Mm.
that like us moderners might maybe see rape as like some moral affront to their autonomy,
Mhm.
but like if they don't have autonomy in this culture anyways, then that's kind of how they would argue. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I do, and there's some degree of truth to that. But when I've done comparative law
Yeah.
between ancient Israel, general ancient Near East, and American law, going back, from the 1700s,
Hmm.
there are some laws, actually, quite a number of laws that in ancient Israel were more favorable toward women than in
Hmm.
most of U.S. history, which is a whole nother set of information. But it's a little shocking, that
Yeah.
that even yeah. So that's a whole nother side conversation. But
Uh-huh.
yeah, but yes, we know that Yeah, it was certainly common, but it was not to be common in Israelite law. So
Interesting.
yeah, but it certainly was common. And of course, there were no marriages. And so men would take women as their wives. And, and throughout the ancient Near East, sometimes there would be just take language, but there was a difference when they were recognized as a wife. So, for example, even Shechem, after the rape of Dinah, he comes back and pleads to let her be his wife, and he will be honorable and so forth. So there's, you can see even within that story, there's a change of language and things like that. So there was a recognition of what's a right relationship, and but nevertheless, exploitation, especially during war. When you get to the Song of Deborah, and they're describing, why Sisera's mother, why isn't Sisera, the Canaanite general coming home? Where is he? After the battle in the book of Judges. And Sisera's mother in this Song of Deborah says, he and his men are out taking a womb or two, which is their word. So that was the expectation. So I'm kind of going a little bit up to the Deborah and Jael story, but that's another side to it. But it's also just the expectation in war of rape.
Interesting. That's really fascinating, and a little dark.
Definitely dark.
So
sorry, I used the wrong word again. Grape.
No, you're totally fine. I think we already messed it up anyway.
Yeah, we
did. And I honestly don't even know how the algorithm works some of these days, anyways. But anyways, okay. So, so it frames it as this Canaanite thing. Then you also talked in your book, and I've read some articles as well, that it says this Judah saw and took of Shua, like it's kind of used in the rest of Genesis. Almost like a little pattern. So Genesis 3:6, it says when Eve sees and takes the apple, like it's almost framed as something negative, although there's different ways people interpret that. Genesis 6:2 says the sons of God see and take the women. Genesis 12:15, the Pharaoh officials see and take Sarai from Abraham. Genesis 34:2. Dinah, daughter of Jacob, visits local woman of city where Shechem's prince saw and took her and lay and debased her. So that's interesting there. And then 2 Samuel 11:2-4, David saw Bathsheba was good, took and lay with her. And also that good tov is also used in Genesis 6 and Genesis 3.
Right.
So what is that language describing in your opinion?
Yeah, from going all the way back to Genesis 3, it is showing a comparison between the way we see and the way God sees, because the structure of especially Genesis 3 and Genesis 6 is the same structure as in Genesis 1, where 7 times, and God saw that whatever it was that he created was good. And so the syntax is the same in Genesis 1 as 3 and 6. And so the distinction is, and I do a lot of work on evil as well, good and evil. I love that camel behind your head. Sorry, I just excuse me, squirrel. But again, there's a contrast that is shown at that very beginning point, that the way God sees, when God sees something and calls it good, that is good. But when we see something that we think is good and take it for ourselves, then that's an indication that we are violating God's creational and relational goodness, when we're taking something for our own selves. And so there's a selfishness to it, an autonomy. That is, we're taking something that God has not given us, because God had given all the trees of the garden, but she took the one thing that was forbidden. And so from that point forward, seeing and taking especially becomes conflated with stepping outside of something that God has sanctioned, when it's simply seeing and taking something that you think is good for yourself, for your own benefit.
Yeah. So you have, just to clarify there, so the narrative is basically saying, hey, like this is the good way to do it. God's doing it this way. And then you have Eve, and then you have the sons of God seeing that they're good and taking it themselves. So they're kind of almost redefining what is good in that way.
Well said. Yeah.
And but I'm not aware of Tov being used in Genesis 38 with Judah. but it still has some type of parallel there. So do you think that's just typical language that's used in this context, or is there something else going on?
Yeah, we do recognize that in the story later on, it's after his wife dies that he feels perfectly free to take a prostitute. So there was certainly some degree, we can, just make an assumption there was some degree of fidelity with that first wife. And so, it seems to be a wife. He has several sons with her and so forth. So, but it's just, seems to be more of a comment on Judah's character at that point, that it's not using the word wife, because almost all the time, wife is going to appear in that kind of a context.
Okay, so you do think it's kind of displaying like, hey, this guy's negative.
Yes, I do.
Okay, yeah, and there's more that happens. So so it says Judah named him She became pregnant again and had another son who she named Onan. Then all this other stuff, and but Judah's firstborn, was evil in the Lord's sight, so the Lord killed him. So some might see this as just some random side note that, hey, Judah, your son's terrible, but whatever, we're just gonna keep on going. But I don't know. My first hunch is like, hey, this is just another comment. Yeah, this Judah guy is so bad that he's a bad parent. Essentially, is that what you think it is too?
Well, it certainly doesn't speak well of him. I mean, but again, we recognize that frequently, both in the Hebrew Bible and in life, a wonderful parent can have a child who's just completely different. A horrible parent can have a child who's absolutely amazing. So there's certainly no direct correlation there. But again, just sort of following the trajectory of what happens and how Judah treats Tamar, it's just not speaking well of Judah in this case. So we have some cases in the Hebrew Bible, like with Eli, he's reprimanded by God for not teaching his sons to do what is right. His sons are called Belial, wicked, worthless. And Aaron also didn't do a great job with, his first two sons died also when they took illegal, fire incense into the holy place and so forth. So there are some indications already that are later on that point to father not doing their job. But again, it's just sort of building a case a little bit with Judah. It's just giving these, we got some problems here. And we don't really hear much about Shelah. He does continue in the genealogy, so Shelah seems to come back into the story. But up to this point, there's Judah is not, doesn't seem to be really caring much about his family.
Right. So you're saying that, hey, like us today, we shouldn't be saying like, oh yeah, the Bible is teaching that we're a bad person if our children are bad.
Yeah, definitely not saying that.
But at the same time, there is good reason to think maybe that this writer is just picking out all the bad things that could possibly indicate that Judah's a bad person.
Yeah. He certainly, the fact that Onan is sexually exploiting his daughter-in-law, and you would think that Judah would know because she's not getting pregnant, and I'm sure he sees what kind of a person Onan is. So, and there's no reprimand, just like David doesn't reprimand his sons either. So we do see certain patterns where abuse is taking place and the father does nothing. And that's clearly.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Clearly, like this isn't just a couple time kind of thing.
Exactly.
So that's a really interesting point. I've heard some scholars, and I want to get your thoughts here, that so you have Genesis 3:15, and you wrote that a little bit about that in your book, and the promise of the seed and the serpent and crushing the head of the serpent, and however that works. But I've heard some other scholars argue, and I've had one on my channel that has argued that, hey, there's kind of like a narrative theme throughout Genesis where it talks about the seed, and basically like kind of like we can track whatever the promised seed is. Like it's like, oh, is it going to be this guy next? Oh, nope, he does something bad. But we're continuing this scene, and there's some narrative points, and then it leads up to Onan, who's with Tamar. Tamar's supposed to be like carrying on that seed, but it's like, shoot, well, she can't do that, and Onan's supposed to be doing that, but he's not doing that. Do you think that's all going on here?
Yeah, there is from Genesis 4 and Genesis 5 onward, there is a looking for, is this the one who's going to crush? Is this the seed of the woman who's going to crush the head? So Noah's father, for example, when Noah's born, he says, maybe this is the one that will deliver us from the itzvon, the grief, the toil of our hands,
Huh.
just using that language from Genesis 3:16 and 17. And so even, Noah's dad is looking for the one. Eve, I have, as I have in the chapter, she calls Seth the appointed, using two words from the Genesis 3:15 promise. And because there's a fun book, I don't know if it's fun, but book by Rabbi David Foreman, the beast that crouches, and he talks about the language that Eve uses for Cain, where she thinks he's the golden child, basically, and this weird birthing language that she gives that's nowhere else in the Hebrew Bible or in Hebrew.
Yeah.
And so indications that this is the golden child, and then he thinks he is, and is mad that God doesn't think so too. And so. Things leading up. So there's indications that Eve was hoping maybe Cain, but certainly real clear indications that she's thinking Seth. Seth's got to be the one. But at least his family line then initiates calling upon the name of the Lord, which becomes synonymous with worship. And the rest of the Old and the New Testament, then worship and salvation. So
yeah, that's really, really interesting.
Yeah.
And let's see here. I think you mentioned that whatever, however you pronounce his name, Judah's firstborn.
Yeah.
The word is protected, protector,
Mhm.
or awake, watchful.
Mhm.
But spelled backward is evil.
Yes,
I think that's great.
Yeah.
Or a little play on words there. And then Onan, or Awin, or however you pronounce that in Hebrew, means disaster, sin, or injustice.
Yeah.
So that's really fascinating. Were you going to say something about that?
Yeah, and depending on the vowel pointing, and of course Hebrew's written without vowel pointing originally. Onan could mean like powerful or strong or something, but you change the vowel pointing, and it does mean disaster or injustice.
Okay.
So again, play on words on both of their names, and then also interestingly in the book of Genesis, there are three places where God takes life, and in each of those three places, so it's the flood, it's Sodom and Gomorrah, and it's Onan and Er. And in each of those three, there are four Hebrew words that are used only in those three passages. And that's the word evil, the word death, and the word corrupt. And that the fourth word, it's used in contrast with the word righteous, somebody who is righteous. And so it's just those three places where God takes life. So that's, to me, that seemed significant.
Yeah,
And
that's really fascinating. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. So that's Genesis 6 with the flood, Sodom and Gomorrah, Genesis 19,
Yeah.
Onan with Genesis 38, and golden calf in
Yeah.
Exodus 32. So that's really fascinating.
Yeah.
And so basically it's like, Tamar is at fault for the death of his sons, and he doesn't let the third son have a child. He's supposed to be doing that. He actively prevents it. And then Tamar pretends to be a prostitute, and basically, or not Tamar, Tamar, and then to try to get Judah to have a child. So I'll just be honest, as a little 8-10-year-old little kid reading my Bible, just going through that 3 chapters a day for the whole year, trying to get through that, I probably would have thought that Tamar was a bad person.
Yeah. Yes.
So that's really interesting. How do you think that in this ancient context that the writer would, or even the Israelites would be seeing Tamar in this context? Because it's like, she's doing what she needs to do. Is that it? Or would they think lowly of her for pretending to be a prostitute? What do you think there?
Yeah, and it is important to both look at the immediate cultural context and also the legacy of her name within ancient Israelite culture as well. And first of all, she was a Canaanite, and she was following Canaanite law, but most of us wouldn't know that. So the ancient Israelites would have had some understanding of it. And it's never glamorous to be a prostitute, even in the other, in reading the ancient Israelite, it's never an exalted position. in most ancient Near Eastern literature. But at the same time, she and I'll also add the Old Testament is not PG-13. It's it's definitely more R-rated in lots of places, but it's extremely blunt and honest. But we do see that the name of Tamar, of course, David names a daughter after her. Absalom also names his daughter Tamar. There's also a city named or a town named Tamar. So again, Tamar becomes a respected name, and she certainly is incorporated then into the line of Judah. So if we're going to vilify Tamar, we also really need to vilify Judah, who pays to take her. So both of them, that both of their lives truly get redeemed. But I don't see the ancients. They certainly wouldn't encourage that as a normal route, but nevertheless, they do recognize that she was seeking justice, and she was taking the only route of justice that was left to her, because she had been she didn't have any other opportunity, because she was officially betrothed to Shelah, and she couldn't get married, and there was no other livelihood. She didn't become a prostitute. She simply did what she needed to do in order to obtain a child legally through the system, the only way that she knew how, because she was not going to get justice any other way. So yeah, it wouldn't be something they would encourage their daughters to do. At the same time, she is recognized as being someone who was willing to be bold and put her life on the line for justice.
Yeah, I appreciate the way you said that. Thank you. And I did find this really interesting. In Genesis 38:24, Judah says, "Bring her out and have her burned to death." I just think it's really fascinating that it's like, that's his first response. We're going to burn her.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe in this culture, stoning is pretty terrible in itself, and that supposedly was common, but at the burning that's harsh.
It's really harsh, yeah. And some of the different scholars that I've read, and I don't know if there's anything definitive, but the ones that I've read have said that he legally didn't have the right to say that. But he was a person of a lot of authority and influence. So that wouldn't necessarily have been the correct response, even under normal legal circumstances. So, but yeah. So even there, as you said, it's like, yeah, that's his first response. Burn her. Yeah. Really loved his daughter-in-law, didn't he?
Yeah, that's crazy.
That's crazy.
And well, to be clear, at this point, he when he says to burn her, he doesn't no, he does. Yeah, he does know it's Tamar. So yeah, that's wild. Yeah, that's crazy. Okay, and yeah, and I was going to say that he automatically blames Tamar for getting pregnant from prostitution. So like that's the first thing he assumes. And I don't know if this would be as bad in this culture, but I mean that seems pretty harsh. It's like, well, what about what if she was raped? Like, why would you just assume that? Yeah, I don't. That seems wrong. Do you have any thoughts there?
Yeah, well, other than, yeah, I agree with you that was his first assumption, which also tells us something about him, because he didn't even make any inquiry. What happened to you? What have you done? There was no conversation. It was just one assumption: burn her. So it was simply, I just read it as simply, let's eliminate her as a problem.
Yeah, I see. Interesting.
Yeah.
And so on that levirate marriage idea, so someone mentioned that so they weren't Levites. I mean, Levite did Levi, the person, even exist at this time point? I don't think it did.
No, levirate, a levir. So it's a levir, not a Levi. So a levir.
Okay.
And so kind of a Semitic term for a relative, a kinsman. So someone who's a kinsman within the kin, just like Boaz is a distant, like, I don't know if he's a third cousin removed or, what, but he is a kinsman. So that's so the levir refers to a kinsman who's going to take responsibility for a destitute widow.
I'm sure I've read that so many times and just missed it. I appreciate you mentioning that.
Yeah.
So basically, I mean, it makes sense that, hey, even like if you want to say like they were even if they were with like this Abraham group or his descendants, and they're kind of separate from the other Canaanite tribes and all that, even at that point, they're still going to be going mostly off the Canaanite laws, just kind of who they are as a group, right? So yeah, it would make total sense for them to have this expectation. Of course, that's just kind of what the story implies. So that's not just an individual Israelite thing. Is the Israelite law different than the Canaanite customs you're talking about?
Yeah, the later Israelite laws are different, and they found a lot of law codes all around the Levant area, and certain similarities, certain differences, and fine tuning and so forth. But they're and so they find some similarities between some of the later Israelite laws and the laws of from Babylonian, Nuzi, and Hittites and so forth. But generally, and there's some really interesting work, especially by Moshe Weinfeld on where the similarities end. And so generally, most of the other law codes are just law codes, for one thing, just as a distinctive. Whereas in the Torah, they're interwoven into story and dialogue and everything in between. So even that is a remarkable difference. But also, as Weinfeld points out, is that most of the other law codes are simply trying to pay for property. So what's this person worth and so forth. But in the biblical law code, it's more, it leans far more toward relationship. How can we restore relationship? So that's an interesting, he's had done quite a bit of work on that.
Yeah, but specifically on the Levirate custom. So is that the same in Israelite culture?
It's the same in terms of having a kinsman, but not the father-in-law. That would be off. That's a no-no. Yeah. So
yeah,
Israelite law, no father-in-law.
I appreciate you differentiating that. Thank you. Yeah. And all right, so you mentioned the dying there. So the place Tamar, is it, how do you pronounce it? Tamar? What is it in Hebrew?
It all depends if I'm talking to an Israeli or an American. Right. So I switch back and forth because sometimes I'm like, who am I talking to? And
Yeah. Right.
I would go Tamar because in Hebrew you usually put the accent on the end, but in America they usually say Tamar. So I usually say Tamar so people know who I'm talking about. But I flip flop on that.
Interesting. That's fascinating. Yeah. I love that when you like read when someone like reading a bunch of like really big words in like Genesis 10 in Sunday school, and they're like, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right. It's like the English is not pronouncing the Hebrew right at all. So, there is no right pronunciation in this case, if that's what your goal is.
That's right.
But yeah, anyway, so say Tamar, whatever, is sitting by the road in a place called Pitha Enayim, open eyes. What do you think of the significance of that?
Well, I mean, it's certainly her eyes were open. Judah's were not. And so, it's just a little side note. So it's just, I look at it as sort of an interesting little thing to be thrown in, that it gives a place name like that.
Yeah.
So an opening of the eyes is, of course, significant from Genesis 3 onward. And so when their eyes are open, it can be used in a positive or negative sense. But in this case, it ends up, Judah's eyes do eventually become open. And so some look at it as perhaps it's foreshadowing that Judah's eyes will become open. But I don't know. I really don't know what else to make of it.
Yeah, right.
So, yeah.
No, it's always interesting how they just throw these random place names in here.
Yeah.
And you mentioned in the book that it's very rarely just a coincidence. Like there's a thematic element or something going on with it.
Yes.
Yeah. And so, Tamar is called righteous by Judah.
Mm-hmm.
Could you explain why he thinks that she's righteous?
I look at it as that justice issue again.
Yeah.
So righteousness and justice so often go together, are paired together, certainly in the Hebrew Bible. And so righteous, she did what was right. She did seek the justice that she deserved, and that was right. And she called him out, and she called him to account for his negligence, because he was negligent in his responsibility toward her. So she was right, he was wrong. So that's one way I look at it as a justice issue.
Mm-hmm. I see. And so we talked about Unan there, And yeah, so Judah is redeemed. So not in like, you wouldn't say he's like redeemed as far as like the kinsman redeemer idea, but like kind of like a redemption, because he's seen as essentially like a bad person. He just plays doing all these bad things or having bad children and all this other stuff. And then it seems like, yeah, like he kind of redeems himself with
Yeah.
Joseph, and even like in the story with Tamar at the end.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a major life turnaround. His character, it's just a 180 character change. You know, if the Hebrew word repent means to basically turn around and go the other way. This is the Hebrew word for repentance being walked out right here.
Huh. Yeah, that's fascinating. Um, I can't help but wonder what like critical scholars would think of that, because like, you know how they're like, hey, yeah, the narrative is being written later because it's like making a message about you know, your descendants or whatever, and you know the Canaanites, they all have bad descendants that do bad things, kind of like as a justification is what their argument would be. But that's really interesting that he starts off bad and then he's good.
Yeah.
So I don't know how they would even frame that as like, why would you want a descendant that did something really bad?
Right. And that's one of the really remarkable things, you know, even in critical scholarship and so forth, is the bluntness of the Hebrew Bible. They're not, they're painfully honest about the horrible things that people that are, you know, some call heroes. I don't call them heroes, but because yeah, every one of them you can see flaws,
Yeah.
but it's painfully honest about it. But it
Huh.
also, you know, I think of Paul's conversation back. These things are written for our instruction and encouragement to give us hope. So anybody who's had a life that was just totally a mess, this certainly is intended, can give you hope. Anybody can change. And but also it also does show frequently that the Canaanites, the foreigners and so forth, are actively involved. God was never ethnically trying to get rid of other ethnicities. He was always trying to bring everybody together. He was trying, so that's why we see the Tamar being lifted up as a Canaanite and becomes an example, just as later Rahab becomes an example. She's put in contrast with Achan from the tribe of Judah, who he loses his whole family, her whole family lives, you know, in the book of Judges. So, yeah. So sometimes we have a skewed idea that God is only for the Jews. He wants all people to come to
Hmm.
know who he is. And so for me, that's also an example that God worked through Tamar to bring Judah to be a man of, to become an upstanding man, to stand up for somebody other than himself and his own selfish wants and desires.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. I appreciate that. So later in your book, you talk about the women in the very beginning of the book of Exodus. People kind of skip over those, as you mentioned,
Yeah.
um, but it's like the women give what you say is, I believe, transgressive acts against Egypt, almost like the writer is portraying this as an attack on Egypt. Could you talk about uh, uh, how that frames and what happens in those narratives?
Yeah, and transgressive acts, I got that from Jacqueline Lapsley, so I can't take credit for that term, but I love it. Carmen Imes used the term freedom fighters. I love that too. I didn't come up with anything better, so I just cite them. But again, you know, the book of Exodus begins, the first chapter, the only names that are given are Judah and his sons, and these two women, Shiphrah and Puah. We're not even sure if they were Israelite or Egyptian. You know, there's a little controversy in scholarship
Yeah.
about, but they are named, which means that they had become famous because they defied the Pharaoh. So the Pharaoh in the opening chapter of Genesis, you know, the first transgressive act, you know, as I call, as Jacqueline Lapsley calls it also, is the fact that the Israelites had become slaves, but they're still, you know, multiplying tremendously, and that freaks out the Pharaoh. He's afraid, you know, what if they, you know, they're becoming so, the more we oppress them, the more they multiply. And
Yeah.
so, but he's only afraid of the men. He's not at all afraid of the women. And so so he tells the midwives, you know, if a boy is born, kill him the moment that child comes out of the womb. But again, they defy the Pharaoh. and they're willing to put their lives at risk because of compassion and doing what is right, saving lives. And the fact that they even kind of use Pharaoh's own prejudices against him, because they say, well, by the time we come there, the women are so lively, is kind of like a translation you could use, that they've already given birth. They use a term that's almost referring to the Israelites as they're multiplying like rabbits. They're uses kind of almost an animal term. Chaya is the word for an animal, and so it's like they're chaya, they're like chaya. They're just like animals giving birth. And the Pharaoh, oh yeah, they're just like animals because their lives are worth nothing to him. These are just slaves. Their lives are worth absolutely nothing. So, and then when the midwife's job doesn't work, then he tells the Israelite people, if you give birth, if it's a boy, throw him in the Nile, and if it's a girl, let her live, because the girls aren't a threat. And that's some of the irony in there, is that it's actually the women who are the ones that effectively undo the kingdom because they're saving these lives. And even in Genesis 2, it just mentions there's an Israelite man who's married to an Israelite woman. They're just slaves, and they have a baby. There's no names given. And this baby's beautiful, so the mother hides him, puts the baby in a little ark using the same word that's used for Noah's. And the little slave sister, she's not named. Nobody's named, not even Pharaoh's daughter's name. But here these slaves are valuing life, and even Pharaoh's daughter has compassion on this little Hebrew slave baby. It's just a slave baby. Come on, it's just a slave baby would be the way that power and so many people would think of it. You would think the Egyptians, but again, they're having compassion on these slaves because their life is valuable, and God honors that. So it's just beautiful how these 5 women who defy the Pharaoh, including Pharaoh's own daughter, which I love the collaboration between a slave mother, a slave daughter, and Miriam was probably, they figure, right around the age of 10, somewhere between 6 and 12 years old. And she has the chutzpah, she has the guts to walk right up to Pharaoh's daughter and says, and personalize, can I find someone to nurse this baby for you? And I just love it. She's that young, but she's already showing her leadership qualities, are already personalized. This is your baby now. And Pharaoh's daughter just simply says, go. And then we find out that this is Moses at the end of the scene. So Moses, just a little slave baby, is saved so that he could then turn around and save the Israelites.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. So I had a couple questions for you on that. Thank you for the summary there. And I think you meant Exodus 2. You might have said Genesis 2.
Oh, sorry. Thank you.
I might have
yes,
yeah, I might have misheard you. I don't know.
No,
but anyway, so there was the interesting thing about, so Shiphrah and Puah and Jacob and his 12 sons, those names are mentioned, but the Egyptian Pharaoh is not. Yeah. So it's almost like you're not even worth mentioning. Mm-hmm. Like that. It seems like that's what's going on. There's something that you mentioned there that I found interesting. But I also wanted to ask you, so you say that Pharaoh asks why the women defied him, and they prey on his ignorance by claiming Israelite women are more animal-like, so they give birth too quickly to be caught. So I'll be honest, I'm a man, and maybe the story might be preying on my knowledge, my ignorance as well. So how exactly did they prey on his ignorance? What did he not know that he should have known? Could you say that explicitly?
Yeah, it's some of it's the language that they use, the fact that they use the language that they do, using the word chaya. It's a small point, but I like paying attention to the details. I think that there's details in there on purpose, but again, usually giving birth is a lengthy process, and we don't know how far away the midwives were, but for them to just say they basically never make it there on time, once in a while, but most men don't pay attention to the birthing process. But again, even preying on his prejudice against the Israelites, because their lives are worthless anyway. So if they're worthless like animals, then he wouldn't question them anymore if they make that sort of play on him, that these are like animals, and we just can't get there on time. So It's so it's yeah. I think it's a very minor point. Also, just going back, I mean, the fact that Pharaoh's name isn't named, there's also we can see it's sort of a development of story making. From around 2000 BC to 1000 BC, and then moving into toward 500 BC and so forth. So history writing does change a little bit. So from the time of David, history writing around the ancient Near East, they're much more likely to give names of kings and so forth. So we do see more of that in the later books than we do see in the earlier books. And some of that is also convention. But again, the historical critics would disagree with me anyway on some of that, but it's nevertheless something that you can observe in reading ancient Near Eastern literature. So it's a side point, but so whether Pharaoh's name isn't named because he's not important or because it's just the convention at that time was to not mention people who weren't that important to the story, even though he's important to the story, it would have been really helpful. Then we wouldn't have these debates as far as, was it Ramses or was it, oh my goodness, I just totally went blank on the name of the
early date.
Yeah, the early date. Yeah, the early date. Sorry, I just went completely blank.
Yeah, it depends who you ask.
Yes, it does. There's a few that they will mention, but yeah.
Okay, we get what your point is. And honestly, I don't really know off the top of my head. But anyway, so I appreciate you mentioning that. So basically, what you're saying is, they defied him, and they basically were like, oh, those Israelites, they're just animal-like. So whether or not they actually believed it, they were kind of just like, almost like sucking up to him. Is that a good way to put it?
Yeah. They were given a really good lie. Yeah. And they're not condemned for lying at all. That's another thing that grates me sometimes. People will condemn them or condemn Rahab for lying, but and there's no place that I have found yet in the Hebrew Bible where someone is castigated for lying to save somebody's life. Yes, you are if you lie to save your own skin or to besmirch somebody else or destroy someone else's character. So a fine point, but God honors them.
Yeah, no, I was going to ask you about that. So you have Rahab. Rahab is basically the prostitute of the wall in Jericho, and she could have given up the Israelites, but then she lied to her own people to save them. Yeah. And then Rahab is spoken very highly of, and it's like, awesome job, Rahab. It's like, well, didn't you just lie? That's a little odd. But as you're saying, you're talking about the Egyptian women, they lied to Pharaoh. And then you also, and this is something I didn't realize to your book, is that it seems like Tamar kind of lied to Judah because maybe she, I don't know, unless Judah specifically said, are you a prostitute? No. Or, yes, I'm a prostitute. Whatever. Deceived her at the very minimum. Yeah. But that's certainly a form of deceiving lying. So you have 3 women in these stories or more, and they're spoken highly of. Yeah. And not only that, but like the book Hebrews and even James, Hebrews 11:31 and James 2:25 speaks highly of Rahab for doing what she did. Right. And then you have so that's really interesting how the writer of these texts is framing it. It's not talking negatively of these women. Yeah. Because people are going to ask, and I don't want to take too much of your time. There is the Torah laws that seem to say like, oh, lying is bad. So just real quickly, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it says giving false witness to your neighbor, but that is for the intent of doing harm for your benefit or somebody else's benefit. So, again, we don't say go around lying to everybody. That's not it. But just like in the Holocaust, for example, people would lie. Do you have any Jewish people in your home? Yes, they're up in the upstairs bedroom. We would commend them for hiding them. If I was hiding someone, if something like that was happening, if I was in an area and there was somebody that was innocent, that was, I've harbored women who were escaping abusers. And if their abuser came to the door, contacted me, do you know where they're? Haven't seen them. I don't know. Why not? I would give the same kind of answer. I heard they moved to that town, and I would feel perfectly righteous in doing that.
Yeah.
So, if I'm lying to somebody about, cheating them or something like that, that's a whole nother story. But I believe that when you're protecting life, that God honors, that's something that would be honored. And because we don't, as you say, we see Tamar and Tamar and Rahab and honored for what they do, never castigated.
Yeah, I appreciate that. That's really interesting there. A lot of interesting stuff there.
Mhm.
Yeah, I'm just make sure I don't miss anything else here. Yeah. I really appreciate you coming on here. I think people should definitely check out your work. Link in the description to be able to pre-order it. And there's a lot more in your book that talks about other really interesting facts and stories that you probably aren't aware of like Miriam and with Bathsheba, debunking a lot of those myths about her. But anyways, I really appreciate you coming on here. Thank you so much. I've been wanting to have you on here for maybe years at this point. I know I messaged you like maybe a year or two ago.
Oh dear.
So I'm glad we can finally do this. This has finally
Yes.
worked out. But yeah, thank you so much for coming on. Any last thoughts? Anything else you want people to know about?
No, I just appreciate, thanks for going in depth with me. It's just been a real pleasure. I appreciate your deep dive in this with me, and hope others will enjoy that from the book as well. And thank you. It's been a real pleasure talking with you.
Awesome. Thank you. I'm so glad to have had you on. But
Thanks.
anyways, for everybody else, check out the book, like and subscribe. If you didn't like this video, subscribe because the next one will be even better, I'm sure. But thank you guys, and I hope you have a good one.